The city had a certain heaviness that night, as if the streets themselves were tired of carrying so many secrets. Los Angeles was alive with its usual chaos, neon signs flickering above corner diners, muffled laughter spilling out of crowded bars, and the endless hum of traffic weaving in and out of the night. But in one shadowed stretch of road, away from the glamour and noise, a young Keanu Reeves was driving alone. His career was just beginning to catch fire, yet the glow of success felt distant in that moment. He was exhausted from a long day of rehearsals, the kind of fatigue that blurs the world around you into smears of color and sound. His car's headlights cut through the empty darkness, casting long beams over the cracked asphalt. The rain had been falling on and off throughout the evening, leaving the pavement slick and reflective like black glass. Keanu gripped the wheel tightly, his mind drifting between lines from his script and the silence of his personal life, a silence he had grown used to but never quite accepted. The world saw a rising star, but inside, he carried the weight of isolation. The car's wipers screeched across the windshield, clearing his view just enough for him to notice the sudden flash of headlights veering across his lane. Another driver, reckless and intoxicated, had lost control, and in the span of a heartbeat, Keanu's quiet drive turned into a nightmare. The impact never came, at least, not in the way it should have. Keanu's hands jerked the wheel, his car skidding violently across the wet pavement, spinning out of control. His chest slammed against the seatbelt as the world outside became a blur of concrete and light. He remembered the sound most clearly, not the squeal of tires or the roar of an engine, but the deafening silence that followed as his car teetered near the edge of a steep drop just beyond the road. For one frozen moment, Keanu stared at the abyss, the city lights shimmering far below. His breath caught in his throat. If the car slipped even an inch further, there would be nothing left but headlines the next morning. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a figure emerged, a man who seemed to materialize from the darkness itself. He was lean but strong, dressed in worn clothes that clung to his frame from the damp night air. Without hesitation, he rushed toward the car, his boots splashing through puddles, his movements driven not by thought but by instinct. Keanu barely had time to process it. 1 second, he was bracing for the inevitable fall, and the next, the stranger's hands were on the hood. His shoulder pressed hard against the metal, his voice a sharp command, "Hold on." With a guttural force, the man pushed, muscles straining, boots sliding against the wet ground until, by some miracle, the car shifted back onto solid pavement. The engine coughed, sputtered, and went silent. Keanu's chest heaved as he stared through the windshield, disbelief washing over him. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his palms trembled against the steering wheel. Slowly, shakily, he opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. The stranger stood a few feet away, his breath visible in the cool night air, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a soaked cap. For a brief second, their gazes met, two men bound by a moment that neither could have predicted. Keanu opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Gratitude, shock, fear, they collided all at once, leaving him speechless. The man gave a faint nod, almost as if to say, "You're safe now. That's all that matters." And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked back into the night. No name, no explanation, no expectation of thanks. Within seconds, his figure dissolved into the rain and shadows, leaving Keanu standing alone under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. The sound of distant sirens echoed faintly in the background, but in that moment, the world felt impossibly still. Keanu realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes fate steps in through the hands of a stranger, and when it does, it leaves a mark deeper than any scar. That night, Keanu drove home in silence, every raindrop against the windshield a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. But more than the fear, it was the image of that stranger, those steady hands pulling him back from the edge, that haunted him. He didn't know the man's name, where he lived, or why he had risked himself for someone he didn't even know. But deep down, Keanu made a vow, silent and unshakable. If life ever gave him the chance, he would repay that act of grace in a way the man would never forget. The days after the accident blurred into a strange mixture of relief and unease. On the surface, life went on. Film sets called, scripts arrived, interviews were scheduled. Hollywood never paused for anyone's private storms. Yet behind Keanu's calm exterior, a quiet restlessness lingered. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again, The blurred headlights, the screech of tires, and the faceless man pulling him back from the edge of death. It wasn't a dream, it was a truth etched so deeply into him that it colored the way he looked at everything afterward. To the world, Keanu appeared unshaken, the same soft-spoken, enigmatic actor rising steadily in the industry. But inside, there was a question he could never shake. Why did that stranger save me? Months turned into years, and still, the memory remained vivid, almost sharper than some of his happiest moments. During long nights in hotel rooms while traveling for film shoots, Keanu would catch himself staring out the window, wondering if the man was out there somewhere, living an ordinary life, completely unaware of the extraordinary impact he had left behind. At times, Keanu tried to search, quietly, discreetly. A few phone calls to local authorities, a handful of questions posed to people in the area where the accident had happened. But the trail always ended in silence. No one seemed to know who the man was, and there were no records of him stepping forward. It was as though he had been a ghost, appearing only to pull Keanu back from the brink, then vanishing forever. Hollywood had its way of distracting even the most grounded souls, but not Keanu. Success came, roles piled up, and the fame he never chased eventually surrounded him. Yet, if anything, the memory of that night made him more distant from the glitter and noise. While other actors bathed in spotlights and celebrated themselves, Keanu sat in quiet corners, lost in thought. The encounter had taught him a truth that no award, no paycheck, could erase. Life was fragile, and sometimes it continued not because of one's own strength, but because of another's kindness. That realization changed him in ways that few people around him ever noticed. He tipped more generously than anyone expected, lingered to help strangers in ways most celebrities would never consider, and lived as if every breath was borrowed. There were lonely nights when the silence of his apartment pressed in too tightly, and Keanu would pour himself a drink and let the memory wash over him again. He thought about how different everything might have been if not for that stranger. Would The Matrix ever have been made with me? Would the laughter on set, the friends I met, the memories I lived, would they exist at all? Or would my story have ended on that rain-slick road? These questions weren't sources of despair, but of deep humility. He understood that fate had intervened in his life, and that gave him a responsibility he couldn't put into words. For the outside world, Keanu Reeves became known as the actor who avoided Hollywood excess, the man who lived simply despite his wealth, the one who carried his own bags and took the subway when he could have called for limousines. But those closest to him, or those observant enough, knew the truth was more layered. His humility wasn't a performance. It was born from gratitude, from the knowledge that his life had once balanced on the edge of nothingness, and that he had been spared by the hands of a stranger. Every film premiere, every success, every quiet walk through the city was underlined by a silent vow: if I ever find him again, I will repay him. Not with words, not with shallow gratitude, but with something that truly matters. It had been more than a decade since that night, yet the memory lived inside Keanu as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. By now, he had built a reputation as both a global star and an enigma, an actor who moved through Hollywood like a ghost in plain sight. Fame had never seemed to cling to him the way it did to others. He slipped away from the noise whenever he could. That was exactly why, between blockbuster projects, Keanu often found himself wandering into quiet towns, places far away from red carpets and flashing cameras. He said it was for peace. The truth was deeper. He was always searching, even if he didn't admit it aloud. One evening, during the filming of a small independent project, Keanu found himself in a town that seemed caught in another era. The streets were lined with aging brick buildings, their paint fading, their windows filled with family-owned shops instead of polished brands. At the corner of one narrow street, just past a flickering neon sign advertising "breakfast served all day," stood a diner. Its windows glowed softly against the falling dusk, the kind of glow that promised warmth and anonymity. Keanu, dressed plainly in jeans, a worn jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low, pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of coffee and frying bacon wrapped around him instantly, grounding him in the moment. A few locals looked up when the bell above the door jingled, then returned to their meals, uninterested. It was exactly the kind of place where he could sit unnoticed. He chose a booth by the window and ordered a simple black coffee, his thoughts drifting as he stared out at the quiet street. And then, almost as if fate had been waiting for this very moment, his eyes caught on the man behind the counter. He was older now, his hair peppered with gray, his posture slightly bent from years of hard work. He wore a simple apron stained from long shifts and wiped the counter with a practiced rhythm. But it wasn't the apron or the years that struck Keanu, it was the face. Though softened by time, it carried the same sharpness in the jawline, the same steady eyes he had seen in the glow of a streetlight long ago. Keanu's chest tightened. His coffee cup trembled in his hand as he whispered to himself, "It's him." For several long minutes, Keanu said nothing. He studied the man quietly, uncertain, afraid to break the fragile spell. What if I'm wrong? What if I've carried a stranger's face in my memory all these years, only to mistake someone else? But as the man turned, reaching to refill a customer's cup, the familiar strength in his movements returned to Keanu like a wave. It was the same strength that had once pulled him away from death. Keanu's heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with something far rarer, the overwhelming shock of destiny fulfilled. When the man finally approached his table to deliver the coffee, Keanu raised his eyes and spoke, carefully, almost cautiously. "Long day." His voice was casual, but his gaze was searching. The man chuckled softly, wiping his hands on a towel. "They're all long, but it's honest work. Keeps the lights on." His voice carried a warmth, but also a weariness that life had etched into him. Keanu nodded slowly, studying him closer. The recognition wasn't one-sided. The man's eyes lingered just a second too long on Keanu's face, as if something in him stirred, some memory he had buried long ago. But he said nothing. No spark of recognition, no acknowledgement. He moved on, tending to other customers, leaving Keanu with a question heavy in his chest. Does he remember me? The hours stretched. Keanu stayed longer than he needed to, ordering a second coffee, then a plate of eggs he barely touched. He watched the man move about the diner with quiet dignity, serving strangers, working tirelessly. There was no sign of glory, no trace of a man who wanted recognition for saving a life. If anything, he seemed determined to blend into the background, just as he had on that rainy night so long ago. And that's when it hit Keanu with even greater force. He doesn't want to be found. When the diner emptied and the night grew late, Keanu finally stood to leave. He placed a bill on the table, far more than the cost of his meal. The man noticed, raising an eyebrow. "That's too much," he said gently, sliding the bill back toward him. Keanu looked him in the eye, his voice steady but layered with meaning. "No, it's not enough." For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. The man's hand froze over the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though something deep within him had been awakened. He didn't ask what Keanu meant, and Keanu didn't explain. But both men knew, in the quiet of that moment, that recognition had finally stirred, unspoken but undeniable. Keanu left the diner that night with his heart racing, his vow from years ago burning brighter than ever. The stranger had been found, and soon he would repay him, not with words, but with something unimaginable. Keanu didn't return to the diner the very next day, or the day after. He waited, quietly, deliberately, as though fate had reminded him of something he was meant to do, but had also challenged him to act with patience. The recognition in the stranger's eyes had been subtle, but it was there, and Keanu knew enough about men like him, quiet, humble, self-sacrificing, to realize he wouldn't simply step forward and claim credit for what he had done all those years ago. No, the man would go on pretending, living his modest life as though he had never saved another's. That humility only made Keanu more determined. Finally, a week later, Keanu returned. The same warm glow of the diner spilled into the street as he pushed the door open, and the same familiar figure moved behind the counter. But this time, Keanu didn't sit in a booth and wait. He walked directly up to the man, meeting his eyes. "Do you have a moment?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a weight the man couldn't ignore. For a brief second, hesitation flickered across the stranger's face. Then he sighed and nodded, motioning toward the back door. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the hum of a buzzing neon sign above them. Keanu turned, searching the man's face, the lines of age, the wear of years of hard work. But beneath all that, the same strength remained. "It was you," Keanu said quietly. "That night, on the road. You saved me." The man's jaw tightened, his eyes drifting toward the ground. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a weary shrug, he answered, "I did what anyone would have done." Keanu shook his head firmly. "No, Not anyone. Most people would have walked away. You didn't. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken memories. Finally, the man exhaled, shoulders sinking as if surrendering to a truth he had long kept buried. I wasn't looking for thanks. I just saw someone in trouble and acted. That's all. His voice was simple, stripped of ego. But Keanu's chest tightened at the thought. This man had carried the memory all these years too, but without pride, without even acknowledging it as extraordinary. As the days passed, Keanu returned again and again, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to talk. Slowly, he learned more about the man's life. His name was Daniel. He had once been a mechanic but had fallen on hard times. His wife had passed away years earlier, and now his daughter was sick, an illness that drained what little he earned from the diner. The medical bills piled high, and though Daniel never complained, Keanu saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet burden of a man trying to hold a crumbling world together. It struck Keanu deeply. Here was the man who had once pulled him back from the edge of death, now standing on an edge of his own, alone, struggling, unseen. The realization was almost unbearable. This was his moment. The vow he had carried all these years echoed louder than ever. I will repay him. Not with words, but with something that truly matters. And so Keanu began to act, quietly at first. The first time, Daniel's daughter received a call from a hospital. The bills that had been drowning them were suddenly covered. Confused, she asked how, but the paperwork revealed nothing. Another week later, a realtor contacted Daniel. An anonymous buyer had paid off the small, rundown home he had been at risk of losing. Shocked, Daniel tried to refuse, but the paperwork was final, sealed, untouchable. When Daniel finally confronted Keanu, his voice trembled with both gratitude and anger. Why are you doing this? I never asked for anything. I don't want charity. His words were sharp, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was overwhelmed, torn between pride and relief. Keanu met his gaze calmly, firmly. This isn't charity. This is a debt. You saved my life. You gave me years I never would have had. You don't think that deserves something in return? Daniel's protest faltered on his lips. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of traffic in the distance. Finally, his voice cracked. I didn't save you for this. I just couldn't stand there and do nothing. His eyes glistened in the dim light, and for the first time, the weight of all those years seemed to slip off his shoulders. Keanu placed a hand gently on his shoulder. And that's exactly why I owe you everything. But Keanu's repayment didn't stop with money. He gave Daniel something greater: dignity, recognition, and friendship. In a world where Daniel had become invisible, Keanu made sure he was seen. He brought him onto sets, introduced him to friends, even spoke of him in quiet interviews, never revealing the full story, but always honoring the idea that his life was forever tied to a man who had once been a stranger. It was unimaginable, not because of its scale, but because of its heart. Keanu didn't simply repay Daniel. He lifted him, restored him, and made him part of his own life. What began as a moment of chance on a rain-slick road had turned into a bond stronger than either of them could have ever expected. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of life's tragedies, but it also crystallizes the moments that truly define us. For Keanu, that rainy night on the edge of death never faded, but now it was no longer a source of haunting. It was a reminder of the bond forged between two men, one act of instinct, and the years of life that followed because of it. For Daniel, the stranger who once saved him, life too began to change in ways he had never imagined. The bills were gone, the crushing weight of debt lifted. His daughter's treatments were covered, and with each visit to the hospital, he no longer carried the dread of financial ruin. Instead, he carried hope. His modest home was secure, his life steadier. But perhaps the greatest gift wasn't material. It was the friendship that grew between him and Keanu. What began with awkward silences and unspoken recognition evolved into late-night conversations, shared meals, and quiet moments of reflection. Keanu wasn't a man of many words, and Daniel wasn't either, but between them, silence spoke louder than any sentence. They had been bound by fate, but they remained connected by choice. Keanu often found himself slipping away from a Hollywood spotlight, retreating to Daniel's diner, where the world felt small, real, and human. There, over cups of coffee that never seemed to run out, they spoke of life, loss, love, resilience, and the strange turns that fate can take. Daniel's perspective grounded Keanu, while Keanu's gratitude gave Daniel a sense of worth he hadn't felt in years. Word of Keanu's quiet generosity eventually began to surface, though never in detail. The public knew him as kind, humble, generous, but no one outside their circle knew the full story. Keanu never wanted the world to see it as a headline. This wasn't about fame or virtue signaling, it was about a promise. Yet the people closest to them began to notice the ripple effect. Daniel, once a man beaten down by life's hardships, became a source of hope for others. He spoke to his daughter about resilience, kindness, and the way a single choice, to act when others might look away, could alter the course of a life. Years later, Daniel's daughter would tell her own children about the man who once saved a stranger's life, only to discover that the stranger was someone the world admired, loved, and celebrated. To her, the story wasn't about celebrity, it was about the truth her father lived by. You never know whose life you're saving when you choose to act with kindness. Keanu, reflecting on it all, often found himself humbled by the symmetry of it. Fame, fortune, and success had always felt hollow to him in certain ways. But the night he nearly lost his life, and the years he gained because of one man's selfless choice, gave everything else meaning. Every role, every film, every laugh, every tear shared with those he loved, they were gifts that could be traced back to that single act. And so, the repayment was never truly finished. Keanu continued to honor Daniel in quiet ways. He brought him into his world without fanfare, ensured his family never wanted for anything, and most importantly, reminded him that his life mattered, not just in that one moment years ago, but in the countless moments that followed. The legacy wasn't in the money, the house, or the medical bills. The legacy was in the bond, the friendship, and the example set for anyone who heard the story. That kindness, even from a stranger, is never wasted. It plants seeds in ways no one can predict. In interviews years later, when asked about his outlook on life, Keanu would smile faintly, his eyes carrying the weight of stories he never fully told. He would speak about gratitude, about how life was fragile, and about how we owe each other more than we realize. And though he never named Daniel publicly, the truth lingered in his words. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change the course of someone's entire life. And sometimes, it comes back around in ways you never expect. The story of that night, and of the years that followed, became more than just a memory. It became a testament to the power of human connection, a legacy of kindness that outlived both men and inspired everyone it touched. And so, when Keanu walked away from the diner one final time on a quiet evening, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the pavement, he felt no grand triumph, no self-congratulation. He felt peace, because fate had brought him full circle, and he had honored the promise he made to himself on that rainy night so many years before. The stranger who once saved his life was no longer a stranger. He was a friend, a brother, and a reminder that sometimes the most unimaginable repayments aren't measured in money or fame. They're measured in love, dignity, and the quiet certainty that you did right by someone who once did right by you.